All right. What we're looking at is it's a piece I created a couple of years ago called Onement, called The Central Fire. And it's an image of a flame, and the verticality of that flame is intended to in some way imitate or evoke or connote the onements of Barnett Newman that I think the first one he produced was in 1948, and this is in some ways intended as a follow-up piece to the discussion provided yesterday that was called a Diogenean, as in Diogenes, performance and or performativity of unpopular public performance of unpopular opinion and or rhetorical question. And that rhetorical question was I won't quite remember exactly how it was formulated because it was rather long and cumbersome, but the rhetorical question essentially involved a reference to the difficult times and the rise of fascism in the United States, and the Supreme Court's decision to regulate what women can do with their bodies, and the deaths that we've experienced because of gun violence, which has become an epidemic in our country. And I've called attention before to the fact that since the year 2020, children's death by gun violence has exceeded death by car accident, which was formerly the largest single cause of children's death in the United States. And recently, in addition to all of this, some states have made it a felony to camp on public land or in city parks, and essentially it's become a felony to be homeless in certain cities in the United States. And the discussion yesterday, centered on the theft of a 18-karat gold tabernacle, which was valued at over $2 million, and this was a possession of a church in Park Slope, Brooklyn, called Saint Augustine. And I asked this question: Does anyone truly believe that if Christ were alive today, and had access to $2 million, that he would spend it on a gold tabernacle? And I want to follow that discussion up beginning with some background related to this piece, Onement, called "The Central Fire," and how it's related to and begins with a reading of Barnett Newman. Both Barnett Newman's Onements and Barnett Newman's great work, The Stations of the Cross. And we'll get to that more later, but The Stations of the Cross has a subtitle, and I won't pronounce it correctly, but Lema Sabachthani, and what that means is its original context is, as far as I know, its original context, it may have existed before that utterance may have existed before that, but as far as I know, its original context is the opening lines of Psalm 22, and what it means there. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, and that those pronunciations are incorrect, but my Lord, why have you forsaken me? And it's uttered once again, by Christ, Jesus Christ on the cross, and of course, he is quoting the psalm, and he did that often, quoting passages from the Torah or other holy and sacred text, and in the context of The Stations of the Cross by Barnett Newman, which he began in 1958 and completed in 1966, it echoes and mirrors in certain ways the work of the Onements, and to get to all of that, we have to talk about when the Onements were created and how many of them there were and why they're called Onements. But as an introduction to that, the 14 stations of the cross, of course, refer to the 14 stations of the cross as it's expressed in Christianity, and the suffering, and then combined with the subtitle, the expression of the turning away, it relates the stations of the cross and the suffering of Christ in his humanity to all of the experiences of a turning away, including the experience of the turning away from the experience of the destruction of the Jewish people in the days of Nazi terror and the Holocaust, and the way that that it situates itself as an elaboration of the one-ments is also interesting. And as I mentioned, the one-ments begin in 1948, and the initial military tribunal, Nuremberg trial, had already taken place. It began in 1945 and concluded in 1946, and then there were 12 trials following that trial, and so totaling 13, which is interestingly situated between the number 12 and the number 14. If the number 12 is significant as a representation of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the number 14 represents the Stations of the Cross, the fact of there being 13 trials, or one initial and 12 following, is interesting in relationship to the numbers of works that constitute the one-ments, of which there are 6, right? And it's hard not to read the 6 one-ments as a symbolic representation of the points of the Star of David, the 6 days of creation, and the representation of the survival rather than rest, right, of the Jewish people. So the title one-ment is an endonym or a translation of the original etymological, literal literal meaning of the word atonement, and the fact that the initial one-ment, or the initial atonement, was created in 1948, suggests that there's a relationship to that historical context in which these trials were taking place. And the fact of there being 6 of them, and relating to the 6 days of creation, is interesting, because if the artist in some ways is making a statement that correlates creation and turning away, the 7th day was intended as the day of rest, and then that in that rest, the artist may have turned back to his work and seen that it was good, and that construct depends upon the notion of creation. But if the days refer to destruction or conflagration, what is the 7th day and the artist turning to look at the work mean in that context? And And so if rest and in some sense satisfaction, is implied in the Sabbath, and the aporia that the one-month's raise is, what does the seventh day mean when the Creator turns to look back at the turning away? And that remains, within the one month's, merely and I'm suggesting that it's there, but it's not, physically present. But I'm suggesting that it exists in the aporia beyond the sixth one month, and even as a question, it's ineffable and in a certain sense, unspeakable. And that that division, that the Newman zip, creates in the surface of the canvas between a left and a right side, or that rises, depending on how you look at that verticality, right? It's either a division, or it's something that brings the two sides together in some ways, or it's an image of ascension. I wanted to not answer that question, but ask it in a different way in this image, and I suppose one of the models, in thinking about, the destruction of human life as conflagration, or Holocaust, right? Which name means, a burning. What was to reframe that question of the seventh day, and perhaps in some ways as mysteriously as Newman's work does, and suggesting but not answering with this image, and suggesting also beyond that the image of the seraphim, who burn, and are consumed, but back into creation, back into the oneness of the Creator. And I hoped that would be implied, and then I also provided that question with a social context related to our time, and none of that was very explicit. I'm going to close this window for the time being, and back up a little bit and look at this is the desktop ekphrasis for today, which is an image of one of the walls in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. that represents or that presents the Stations of the Cross by Barnett Newman. These are some of those stations, and again, you know, remembering that these stations have the subtitle, "Why have you turned away from me?" Asking this question and bringing the suffering of being abandoned by God and forgotten, right, to the context of the Jewish Holocaust, specifically, you know, in the 20th century, but also as an existential question, right, and a condition of our experience as and I almost want to say always already subject to abandonment as process of our tragic, right, development into adulthood, and you know, not only, you know, through the loss of an idealized Edenic paradise, but by abandonment of our Creator, right? So in a way, an existential, you know, Mary Shelley's political and feminist, you know, criticism of the Father is here addressed as a condition of you know, our very humanity and ability to accept the conditions of our existence and our world, and And part of those conditions, you know, involve making sense of that turning away, and I would argue that in its most profound sense, Barnett Newman's Onement and Stations of the Cross, why have you abandoned me, is not only an indictment of the persecutors and the destroyers, are human persecutors and destroyers in this particular period, and involving these events of destruction, referred to as the Holocaust, and not only an indictment of the Nazis who participated in this destruction, but also an indictment and a demand for an atonement on the part of the Creator in that seventh day, in which, you know, there can no longer be any rest, and an attempt to redefine and re-understand what a Sabbath can mean after the Holocaust, right? It can no longer mean a day in which I rest and sit and as a microcosm of the divine, as a creator of a work of art, look back at what I've done and admire it. So the analogy between the indictment of the creator having turned away is also an indictment of the artist creating works of unproblematic beauty and value, and profiting from those works of unproblematic beauty and value. And this, I think, is what, although he never quite gets at it, I think it's what Lyotard is attempting to get at when he describes and comments upon the work of Barnett Newman and its relationship to the sublime. The sublime being more than merely the absence of an obvious iconography or iconology of the verticality and the separation of darkness and light, but the meaning of looking upon the turning away in a moment in which, you know, rest and self-appreciation is no longer possible. And so the very meaning of the holy day no longer belongs to the metaphysics of creation, but is always already inhabited or haunted by the spirit of this conflagration or destruction, and that is very difficult to name or describe, and hence, you know, Lyotard's, you know, failure to do so, and hence, you know, my failure to do so concisely here, and to grasp only in fragments and suggestions. Now how this idea of atonement and the Stations of the Cross and Barnett Newman and these ruminations that I've been, you know, providing for them, how they relate to the theft of this 18-karat gold tabernacle that I began discussing yesterday in this church called St. Augustine in Park Slope, still needs to be elaborated, and the connection still needs to be substantiated in some way. But recently, and this is a web search for Pope Pius XII, and recently it has come to light that that Pope Pius XII, you know, during the rise of Hitler in Nazi Germany, had meetings. I don't know
had meetings
where
with,
this image is
with
from,
Hitler.
or if it's and
part of the historical period, but it reminds me of the political collages of John Hartfield. In any case,
complicit in the destruction that that we largely, in any case, this
Hitler
long
and the
kept
Nazis responsible
secret,
but
speaks
that many
speaks
other
powerfully
institutions made possible
to the work of Barnett Newman
as well,
and the idea of atonement.
There are a number of articles,
and the events.
I'll just click on one.
But
are provided a broader context.
It's very different.
My suggestion
type of modernist style referenced here than the Newman, but clearly, referring to
the ideas. That the ideas, the part of Christ that was sacred, the healer, the teacher, is poorly represented by a display of ostentatious wealth, and that would be better used in the service of helping the poor and recovering the rights of those who are being oppressed. And in the context of this history and the stain of this Pope Pius XII's support and collaboration with Hitler, I thought that just like an atonement was provided in the 13 trials of Nuremberg, that may or may not be referenced in the Barnett Newman 14 stations of the cross. The 14th station of the cross in some ways would represent the 12 trials following the first were equivalent to something like 2 sets of 6 days, or a trial representing each of the tribes of Israel. And perhaps the 13th was what we make of what can be the looking back when there was no looking at, looking back when there was only a turning away. And perhaps that that number 14 represents a relationship to the 12 disciples, and the number 13 as those present at the table, and perhaps not, but it did occur to me that an atonement could be made, and since I began with a discussion of how the values of art could be better utilized in a Christian context, to care for the poor and the hungry and the sick. I thought an atonement could be made on the part of the Vatican and Rome in relationship to the Holocaust, and that something of great value could be sacrificed or sold, and that money, could be used to ensure that fascism, and we see its rise today, could be defeated, with these resources. And I thought, well, if this tabernacle is worth $2 million, what does the Vatican have that's worth enough money that its resources could defeat these growing forces of fascism today? And before we look at that, here's an image of Barnett Newman's Onement, which, as I mentioned, is a translation of the original etymological significance of the word atonement. And so I thought, what does the Vatican have that it could contribute as an atonement to this collaboration with fascism? And this is an image of Stations of the Cross. And I thought of this. I thought of the Sistine Chapel and how valuable. Some seems to be edited. The Sistine Chapel edited. Well, we are still a very puritanical culture, aren't we? The Sistine Chapel edited for the internet. But I thought of the Sistine Chapel because it's invaluable, isn't it? It must be one of the most valuable artifacts of our world today. And if the Vatican sold it, and I imagine that process would be quite complicated, but if they sold it, how much money would be available, and how much use those resources could be in the process of making an atonement, so that it could look back at its turning away and its contribution to the conflagration, and make meaning, make real Christian meaning in the sense of what Christ asked in his doctrine to be performed as sacrifice for the sins of the world. Make real meaning from that point in which the question is raised, how can I rest? And what does the Sabbath mean after the Holocaust? And so my suggestion for today is that, just like the churches in Brookland and Park Slope, could better use the resources of their valuable artifacts, helping the poor and the homeless and the sick and the politically disenfranchised, that the Vatican could make its atonement by utilizing the resources available in the wealth of this image to fight fascism and its rise, its global rise, so that in fact never again really does mean never again, no matter what the cost of the never again is to one's sense of ownership and private possession and display. And just like yesterday's discussion, I imagine this will be an unpopular opinion.